Chapter 5 is a very interesting chapter. Chapter 5 is about personalities and values. Now, in this chapter, probably to a greater extent than any other chapter in this course, is going to look at personality types and really getting into psychology. I mentioned at the beginning of the course that there's a lot of psychology involved in this course, and so far we haven't seen that much of it, but in this chapter we're really going to see it more so than in any other chapter. And that's because personality is really a psychological aspect of a person. Personality is the sum total of ways in which an individual reacts and interacts with others. Personalities can be described very generally, things like submissive, ambitious, loyal, timid. Those are all very, very general ideas in terms of how to measure personality. In this chapter, we're going to discuss it in a little bit greater detail and try to make a determination of how we discuss personality, how we measure it. And we're not going to really focus on one system. We're kind of going to give you a little bit of an overview of a few different personality systems in this chapter. How do you actually measure personality? Well, you can have self-report surveys. You can go online right now, by the way, and measure Google personality test, and you'll probably have 10 or 15 or 20 or even more different utilities that you can use to try to figure out your own personality. Now, you might know your own personality, but you can actually take a series of opinion questions and maybe true or false questions like, I like to go out on a sunny day and go to the park and play ball. True or false? I like to ham it up in a party. I like to work with others. I like to think about things deeply. I like to be organized. And based on a series of these types of questions, some websites and some utilities and psychological testing services will try to kind of pigeonhole your personality a little bit and try to give you a little bit of a determination of what your personality is relative to others. Personality determinants, in other words, how a person actually gets his or her personality, depends on a variety of different factors. There's heredity, and heredity is the idea that it's really based on what a person is born with, something that's inherent in a person's DNA that helps shape the person's personality. Then there have been twin studies that have shown that genetics are more influential than parents, and what those kinds of studies mean is sometimes you'll have situations in which, let's say, identical twins or siblings separated at birth are raised in two different environments, and some studies have shown that they tend to have personalities that are somewhat similar to each other, even though they might have been raised in totally separate environments with totally separate values and everything. Because of their personality, because of their heredity, because of their DNA, they still had somewhat similar personalities. Environmental factors also have some influence. How a person grows up and the attitude of the person's parents, the attitude of the people who are influential on the person, of course, also have an impact, as we can all probably figure out. But those two are the main factors, the old psychological debate of nature versus nurture. Heredity being nature and environmental factors being nurture, how a person is brought up. Aging also influences level of ability and influences personality. People, as they get older, maybe they get a little calmer, they get a little more collected, they see things in a little bit more in terms of shades of gray rather than black and white. But the basic personality, at least we're looking at the underlying theory that the basic personality of a person is constant. So now let's continue with the chapter, looking at our first and the one we're going to spend the most time on in terms of personality frameworks and personality identifiers. And that is the Briggs-Myers type indicator. The Briggs-Myers type indicator was featured in a book that I read when I was young called Appreciate People by Dr. Mary Madihan, and that's why I put a little picture of the book. You don't have to read the book. I'll tell you a little bit about the very basics of it. And the idea of the Briggs-Myers personality system kind of bifurcates or separates personalities along four different axes. In other words, among four different aspects of personality. Now, obviously, it's not like you're either one or the other. You could be a combination of both. You could be a little bit of a mix. You could be a strong extrovert or a weak extrovert. You could be a strong thinking person or a strong feeling person, or somewhere in between. So these are not issues where it's definitely one or definitely the other. It could be a little bit of a mix, but still this is a useful way of looking at personality types. And the four categories are extroverted versus introverted. Extroverted is somebody who likes to deal with things as part of a group, likes to deal with people. Introverted is somebody who thrives on his or her own. It doesn't mean an extrovert never wants to be alone. It doesn't mean an introvert never wants to be with other people. It just means in terms of overall tendency. Even introverted people need other friends, but maybe it will be a little bit less important, or maybe they like to spend more time by themselves. Sensing versus the intuitive. The sensor is the person who's really down to earth. The intuitive is the person maybe whose head is in the clouds a little bit, maybe a little absent-minded, but somebody who likes to think really deeply about things, whereas the sensory person worries about things that are tangible, that are touchable, maybe has a little bit more of a hard time with abstract concepts. Thinking or feeling, this is logical versus more emotional. More logical are people who look at things based on logic and not emotion, and emotional people are who let emotions guide their actions and thoughts more so than logic. And then there's judging or perceiving. Judging or perceiving is the idea where the perceiver is somebody who looks at rules as only useful insofar as they're agreed with, or that they're useful in this particular area, whereas the judging person likes to have everything in order. The person who's the judger likes to be on time, have a clean desk, have everything in order, even though those things might not in and of themselves have any tangible benefits, but they're the right thing to do, and therefore let's do it and let's have everything orderly. Whereas the perceiver is the person that says, well, I'll be on time if it makes sense to be on time for this particular meeting, otherwise I'll be 10 minutes late and big deal. Or the perceiver says, this rule doesn't really make sense in this case, so I'm going to ignore it. Those are the four basic underlying personality types, or axes, on the Myers-Briggs system. Now, I want to delve a little bit deeper into this Briggs-Myers system because of the fact that it's so useful in organizational behavior and in psychology in general, and I think it's the sort of thing that's good to know anyway, just in terms of appreciating and understanding other people. This is from the website of the Myers and Briggs Foundation, and this is a discussion, in case you're curious about what the URL is, if you want to visit yourself and poke around a little bit. It is MyersBriggs.org, MyersBriggs.org. And what this does is, and this is really what we've already discussed, the E versus the I, the S versus the N, the T versus the F, and the J versus the P. In terms of how they put it, the extrovert is the person who might say, I'm outgoing, or a people person. That's probably a very good extrovert. By the way, there's no right or wrong. It's not like an extrovert is better than an introvert. It's just different, and certainly each one has advantages and disadvantages. I have a wide range of friends. I sometimes jump too quickly into an activity without thinking it over. The introvert is somebody who might be considered reflective or reserved, more comfortable, they can do on their own. I prefer to know just a few people. It's fairly obvious the difference between the extrovert and the introverts. The S and the N dichotomy is a little bit more complex, but let's take a look at this. The sensory person is paying attention to physical reality, sensory, touch, hear, taste, smell, remembering events, like kind of a very specific memory. Not necessarily a better memory, but a memory that focuses on physical characteristics. I start with facts. I look at the bottom line. I don't look at the overall philosophical underling. The N, on the other hand, thinks more deeply about things, I suppose. I read between the lines rather than just taking what I read at face value. I'm interested in doing things that are new or different. I like the bigger picture, finding out facts. Again, a little bit more abstract. And you could say, I guess, absent-minded. And being an N myself, I guess I don't mind making fun of myself a little bit in terms of being a little absent-minded, but that's okay. And then we've got the T and the F. The thinking versus the feeling dichotomy. This is probably the easiest to understand even without looking at this site. But the thinking person is governed by logic, who makes decisions with his or her head. This is more common among men than women, and want to be fair rather than being unconditionally loving. I can be task-oriented or uncaring or indifferent. That's, I guess, the negative of the logical side of being perceived as being cold-hearted. And then you've got the F, which is the opposite. The F looks to be a little bit more emotional. I look for what is important to others and express my concern for others. I believe being tactful is more important than telling the cold truth, maybe shading the truth a little bit to make somebody feel better. And the downside of the feeler is maybe looking at things a little bit too idealistic or mushy or indirect. And finally, we have the J versus the P. This is probably the one that is least obvious in terms of the difference between the judger and of the other axes, of the other dichotomies. The judger is the person who doesn't like to do things at the last second, who likes to make a plan and likes to stick to it, likes to follow the rules because they're the rules, and they probably make sense if they're the rules. They like to have things decided, task-oriented. If you like to make lists and follow those lists, it's one thing to make lists, it's another thing to actually follow the lists. That's characteristic of a judger. A perceiver is someone who doesn't necessarily mind waiting for the last minute and figures, well, there's a deadline approaching. This is my zone. This is where this is where I work best when the pressure. I work in bursts of energy, stimulated by an approaching deadline, and I like to keep my options open. That's another perceiver. Doesn't like to make too many plans because they'd like to keep their options open until the last second. For myself personally, this J versus P dichotomy is the one where I'm most unsure about in terms of myself. I'm pretty sure I'm an I, I'm pretty sure I'm an N, I'm pretty sure I'm a T, but I'm kind of balanced when it comes to J or P. I'm judging in that I like to get things done in advance, and I like to come on time, and I like to make sure that things are planned. I don't like to make last-second changes, but I'm a perceiver also in that I like to be able to change things when I can. I like to, I don't necessarily follow rules that I don't think are applicable in a particular situation, and certainly I like to approach work as play, or mix work and play. I do things in my job that I consider to be fun. But anyway, so that's just a little personal anecdote over here. One interesting thing down here is that you can actually use this website to take the strong interest inventory and to take a little personality type quiz, and it will tell you which of the 16 types it thinks you are. And because of the fact that there are 4 different dichotomies, there's E versus I, S versus N, T versus F, and J versus P. So there's 4 dimensions, and each dimension has 2 possibilities. So there are 16 personality types altogether. And these are just some very brief words that describe or indicate some of these personality types. For example, let's say the ISTJ is somebody who's introverted, sensing, thinking, and judging. And that person is described by someone who's quietly systematic, factual, organized, logical, detailed, conscientious. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're all of these things, but these are things that generally indicate the ISTJ. I know personally I've always kind of not been sure, as I mentioned, whether I'm an INTJ or an INTP. Reading these 2 descriptions, and reading descriptions in general like I was before I started this recording, I'm probably more of an INTJ, although I have some P characteristics. These are words that appeal to me, especially, well, logical, independent, determined. Okay, I mean, INTP, I like ingenious, that's for sure. But, I guess one of these 2. If you look at ESFJ, let's say, for example, sounds like a wonderful person, but that's not me. And that's perfectly okay. It doesn't have to be me. But reading this site and reading about the Myers-Briggs and reading about some of these differences can actually help you appreciate, not only in terms of organizational behavior, but in terms of appreciating other people in your family or friends who might look at things differently, not because you have a substantive disagreement, but just because they have a little bit of a different personality than you might. And for the rest of the chapter, we're going to be looking at different models and different ideas of personality. These do not contradict Briggs-Myers or Myers-Briggs, but there are other aspects of personality that's important when it comes to organizational behavior. Here are some examples that are referred to as the Big 5 model, of 5 traits that could be helpful when it comes to running an organization. Extroversion, the ability to work with other people. Agreeableness, not necessarily fighting things or willing to bend your own opinions based on what other people think. Conscientiousness, obviously trying to make sure that everything gets done and taking responsibility for getting them done. Emotional stability, you all know what that means, not breaking down. And openness to experience, the being open to experience new things and to learning from things that happen. And there's a strongly supported relationship to job performance with all of these. You don't necessarily have to be an extrovert, but you have to be willing to at least behave or work with other people. And of course, there are reasons why all of these things help. They're relevant because people who are emotionally stable think negatively less and have a higher satisfaction. People who are extroverted have a little bit of a leg up in terms of interpersonal skills. And it improves performance, leads to higher satisfaction. Again, openness allows creativity and flexibility. Agreeableness, people tend to be better liked than when they're insisting that they're right no matter what. And conscientiousness, of course, are people who make better effort and persistence, have better discipline, better organization. Obviously, that has fairly obvious ramifications for work. Then we've got some other aspects of personality. You've got the quote-unquote dark triad. Now this is the opposite of the big five. The big five were good things, and now we got bad things. These are things that tend to obstruct organizational behavior, or behavior in general, relationships in general. Machiavellianism is the idea of the means justify the ends. You know, Machiavellian, this is named after Prince Niccolo Machiavelli from Italy, I guess, in the 1500s, I believe he lived. He wrote a book called The Prince, in which he said that essentially what a leader should do is a leader should do whatever is necessary for the best to gain and seize and hold power. You know, if you have to kill people or you have to torture people or whatever it is, well, you know, you have to do it. You have no choice. You shouldn't worry about the consequences. And that's, you know, even ever since then, this idea of being Machiavellian is not taking human considerations into account, but just doing absolutely anything necessary to further your own interests or further the interests of your organization. Obviously, that's bad because people like this tend to be emotionally distant, believe the ends justify the means, and when you believe that, you usually do things that are bad means and for the end. Narcissism. Narcissism literally means like being in love with yourself. Figuratively, it means people who have an overinflated view of themselves, who, you know, worry about themselves. Obviously, everybody worries about themselves to some extent, but only worries about themselves to the exclusion of other people. People with a grandiose view of the self become arrogant, they become self-entitled, and that's not good for working with an organization. Then there's psychopathy, or the person being a psychopath. You've all probably heard that word. A psychopath is somebody who doesn't have concern for others and doesn't feel guilty. You know, a person can murder or steal or commit crimes and they don't feel bad about it at all. And that obviously could be extremely bad, not only for within an organization, but for society in general. You know, many arch criminals are described as psychopaths. In terms of more personality traits and personality frameworks, our next issue is the idea of motivation. Now, motivation is going to help no matter what, or hurt no matter what it is that you're trying to do. But there could be approach motivation, which is the idea you try to motivate a particular activity, to pay attention to a positive stimulus. If you do this, I'm going to reward you. And there's avoidance motivation, is the aversion, which means the desire to stay away from negative stimuli. Don't do this, or I'm going to punish you. Those are both things that we're taught as little kids from the time we're barely old enough to walk, and those are things that stick with us, certainly in an organization as well, or as an economist would call it, incentives. There could be positive incentives or negative incentives. Other personality traits that are relevant to organizational behavior, again, these are things that are all very useful in the context of somebody working in an organization. Self-evaluation. People with positive core self-evaluation like themselves. This is not necessarily a bad thing like narcissism, but people who are self-confident are more likely to be able to do a good job. They're more likely to think that their contribution is worth something and to make those contributions. People who self-monitoring, that's an important aspect of organizational behavior. Self-monitoring is, are people honest with themselves? Do people look at other factors in terms of how people are going to react to their actions, and do they adjust their behaviors accordingly? And do they have proactive personalities? A proactive personality is somebody that takes the initiative, takes action, perseveres. These are, of course, all things that will help when it comes to being effective within an organization. And then we've got two different, I guess, ways of looking at, or theories, with regard to not only a personality of somebody, but how that personality impacts a person's behavior in a given area. The situation strength theory is the way it holds, I guess you can say, that the personality translates in behavior depending on the situation. In other words, the situation is the thing that really determines our reaction more than anything else. And you have to look at the aspects of the situation to determine how a person is going to behave. Now, people may be predisposed to behave in a certain way, but this theory is that the situation is really the thing that determines how we react. On the other hand, you've got the trait activation theory, which predicts that in some situations or events activate a trait more than others. My underlying philosophy or my underlying personality, let's say, for example, is to be introverted. And the fact that I go into a party that's really loud and really rambunctious, that just activates my trait of being relatively quiet. Here's an interesting little chart on the trait activation theory, which is based on these are, of course, a bunch of different professions that you see over here. And these are some of the professions these professions draw on these personality traits. A person could have some excellent personality traits and some weak personality traits. Getting a job that focuses on those strong ones will obviously help the person in the long run. An air traffic controller has to be detail-oriented, doesn't necessarily have to worry about dealing with angry people. For example, if you want to work in aviation, you want to work in, for an airline, if you're very empathetic and people like the way you speak and you're able to, to calm people down, well, then you probably want to be, a flight attendant or a customer service representative for an airline. Whereas if you're very, very detail-oriented, but you don't really have such a great he's not so great at dealing with angry people, well, then an air traffic controller would be a good idea, because air traffic controllers have to be very detailed, but they don't necessarily have to deal with angry people, other than the pilots that get annoyed every now and then. But this is just some examples of where you should not. These are some of the things where your job's scoring high, and then you have some jobs scoring low. The traits listed here should not predict behavior in these jobs. Detail orientation is not that important in a model. Social skills, there's not that important in a software engineer, but it is very important in a concierge. Innovation is not so important in a medical technician who doesn't have to innovate, just has to run the machine, where it is important in an actor or a systems analyst. So that's some of the ways in which you can judge how a personality is going to impact your ability to do a particular job. Next, we turn to something that goes a little bit deeper than just personality. We're going to look at values. Now, values are something that, well, let's look at the slide. It's a enduring conviction that a specific mode of conduct or end state of existence is personally or socially preferable to another one. Value is something that's inherent, that a person believes is appropriate in terms of a state of conduct or a state of existence, as it says in the slide. It doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. Value is, you believe that people ought to be honest. That is a value. It's more than a personality. A personality is where something. Okay, and values, of course, come from, I wouldn't say heredity, but from background and value systems that are passed down within a society or within a family or both. They could be. These values, and there are many different types of values. There's values of education, prizing education, of being honest, of working, earning a living wage. I mean, these are positive values, and there are negative values of being malcontent or being jealous or whatever it is that could be passed down as well. The values are important to sort by content, which is how important they are, intensity relative to other values, and overall, how a person fits within the value system of his or her society is important in terms of organizational behavior, as well as many other factors. And now we're going to kind of finish up the chapter by looking at a couple of other thoughts from experts in this area. There's Rokeach or Rukeach. I've heard it pronounced both ways. Either way, the value survey is that there are different, this philosophy is that there are two different types of values. There are terminal values, which are end state values, the sort of values that, I want to be a very smart person, I want to win a Nobel Prize, I want to be remembered as somebody who's really nice, I want to have a big family, whatever it is, I want to be a matriarch, whatever it is. Then there are instrumental values, which are the modes of behavior. I think it's best to behave honestly, I think it's best to behave fairly. Then, a little bit more relevant to organizational behavior is the Holland's hexagon. And that's a philosophy that states that job satisfaction, turnover, which really relates to job satisfaction, is based on how closely your job relates to your personality. We've got 6 areas of personality over here. Realistic, somebody who doesn't have their heads in the clouds, somebody who's investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. Those are just 6 different types of areas, and the person's personality indicates which section the person should be in. A social might be a teacher, a social worker, a psychologist, somebody like that. Artistic might be a singer or a painter, or something to that effect. Investigative, somebody who doesn't necessarily mean like a detective. It means somebody who looks into things, who tries to figure things out. A researcher. Realistic, somebody who has kind of a physical, hands-on job. Conventional, enterprising. These are all things that, based on, people should take jobs based on what their interest is. I remember when I was back in college, I took an exam called, not really an exam, but a kind of a survey called the Strong Interest Inventory to determine what my strongest interests were, and it was like 550 true or false questions, and based on that, they said, you score that high in that group, and that high in that group, and it recommended that I take training in areas that were a little bit more intellectual, a little bit more investigative, and a little bit less, realistic and conventional, for whatever that's worth. Okay, so that's really kind of part of the philosophy of the fit between the person and the organization, and that is that it's more important than that the employee's personalities fit with the organization than with any specific job. If I am a car manufacturing company, you're going to have a different personality in the organization itself, and therefore a different personality in the individuals that run it, than, let's say, a law firm. And when we're producing cars, we're producing something, for a physical object for people, where for a law firm, we're trying to intellectually carry the day for something. And now, really, the last section of this chapter is international values. Values are going to be different when you're dealing with people in different societies, when you're dealing with people in different cultures. And the way to measure that is along 2 indices, which has a lot of overlap. As we'll see, they're very similar to each other. The Hofstede model and the Globe model. The Hofstede model looks at things along 5 different dimensions, the Globe model along 9 dimensions, but they're pretty similar. You've got the power distance index. Now, the power distance index, or the power distance, is defined as the extent to which people who are kind of lower on the totem pole accept that. A high power index would say that the most powerful system, the caste, the upper crust, is looked at as being the elite of the society, whereas lower power distance would say, it would say everybody should be equal. Individualism versus collectivism. Do people generally look at things from a perspective of the group or the individual? Masculinity versus femininity. Are masculine traits put as a premium? premium, or feminine traits looked at as at a premium, or some kind of combination. Again, you're not going to have 101 and 0 of the other, but you could have a different mix. You could have 60-40 or 40-60. Uncertainty avoidance is defined as the society's tolerance for ambiguity, which means are the rules very strict, or are the rules kind of loose? The higher the score of uncertainty avoidance, the less strict the rules are going to be, whereas stricter societies want things to be more orderly. And long-term versus short-term orientation, which is the connection between the past with the current and future actions or challenges, kind of the conservative versus almost the liberal view, or the conservative versus the progressive view, I would say this dichotomy is. The one you'd look at the idea of the conservative view is more like we have to look at the past and kind of keep things the way they are unless we have a really good reason to change it, whereas the long-term orientation, or the progressive view, would look at, we don't need to worry about the past, we just need to worry about what's best for the future. And you can actually look at a lot of different cultures in a lot of different countries based on these factors. Great Britain, for example, has a very high individualism ranking, 89, which is the third highest individualism ranking, only behind Australia and I don't see number 1 on this chart, but I guess there are some countries that are missing from this. Looks like the United States is missing from this. Everything below P looks like it's missing. But anyway, there are some countries, like Japan, for example, that would have a much lower individualism ranking. In Japan, they're focusing a little bit more on the collective, on the group, on the company, rather than on the individual. And you can look at this chart. It's kind of interesting. Certainly don't have to memorize it, but you can see how different countries value different things. The globe model is, there's a lot of overlap between this and Hofstede. Assertiveness. How much do people value the ability of people to give suggestions and be heard, as opposed to doing what you're told? Future orientation, which is similar to long-term versus short-term orientation. Gender differentiation. How much does a society prize every complete equality between the genders, or does a society establish different roles for the genders? Uncertainty avoidance, that's kind of like the uncertainty avoidance index that we saw before in the Hofstede model. Power distance, which we also saw in the Hofstede model. Individualism versus collectivism, which we also kind of saw in the Hofstede model. Do people look at things in terms of their individuals or for the greater group of society? In-group collectivism. It's one thing to have collectivism in a society. It's another thing to have collectivism in your particular company. And performance and humane orientation. How do people look at, define a good performance, and how much does society prize fairness and being humane to people within the organization and throughout the society?